Hello everyone, I'm here with Jenny Molloy at the iGEM Jamboree. And yeah, I'm going to let Jenny introduce herself. We have already spoken with her quite a number of times actually, so you may remember that we had her on a Science Spotlight before, and also at the Symbio for Africa forum that we hosted a couple of months back. But Jenny, welcome to the stage, and feel free to introduce yourself to our audience today.
Thanks. Thank you. Yep, so my name is Jenny Molloy and I'm a group leader at the University of Cambridge. I also work at the International Centre for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, leading a biomanufacturing group as of last month. So the clue is, I guess, in the name of the research group, that we work on distributed manufacturing of reagents, particularly in the global south. And when I talk about reagents, I basically mean things for molecular biology that are either research related, so PCR reagents, that kind of thing. We also have a great interest in producing diagnostic reagents, again either cheaper amplification techniques than PCR or PCR itself, and we're getting a little bit further into now thinking about local production of industrial enzymes. So how can we kind of increase sustainability through local production? And we're very much based on that idea of distributing the manufacturing from a currently very centralized system of manufacturing to one where enzymes are being produced around the world, much closer to the point of use.
Super interesting. And so I guess, a fundamental part of building a distributed biomanufacturing ecosystem is community, right? And so how are you guys thinking differently about community, and what types of activities do you engage in to make sure that you've got all of the people both trained and knowledgeable, but also being able to actually produce these things?
Yeah, I think we think about community in two ways. So I always think of the access to the reagents as being a three-pronged problem. So one is technology, and my research group develops DNA toolkits and other protocols and technologies. But then there's a question of kind of how do you disseminate that to a very broad audience through building a community that shares knowledge and has training and other kind of programs. But there's a sort of a third prong, which is entrepreneurship, and how do you kind of build companies that can scale your mission? Because for reagent manufacturing, at least, we think that is the way, like a revenue generating model is the way to kind of ultimately be sustainable. And those two are very different communities. So we're building a community called Reclone that is really focused on the academics, the researchers, the end users of the reagents, and the people who may be manufacturing for their own lab, for a collection of labs. And through that, we want to bring people together so that they can troubleshoot with each other. So this reduces the burden on kind of a centralized team. I feel like it's kind of pointless to have a decentralized biomanufacturing network and a decentralized distribution of DNA if all of the troubleshooting and technical support is very centralized. So we have a forum which we're currently kind of working with Pavilion, who are kind of community building experts, to make that more user friendly and have people contribute questions, protocols, like this has worked, this hasn't. We have a monthly community meeting online where we have a member of the community present, and sometimes more recently, contributions, for example, to our extension of our DNA toolkits is through that forum and the meetings. We have occasionally symposia where we kind of have bigger questions that we want to answer and have people from outside come and inspire us with their approach to manufacturing or community. So I think I wouldn't say that we've trodden a very innovative path in terms of the mechanisms of building community. We have somewhere people can talk online. We have meetings, but I think it's kind of, we're now thinking how do we regionalize that and have a combination of physical and virtual interactions. And so we're building out what we're calling Reclone nodes in Ghana, the Philippines and Argentina, which will physically house the DNA toolkits and distribute them locally, but also be for training and for local community building. And so I think that's the way that we want to, again, decentralize, so it's not just one group, but that there are really strong regional hubs. And we are still at the very start of that journey, so we're learning a lot from communities like iGEM, like Valley DAO, that have kind of got different models, and seeing how it adapts to our situation.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's super interesting how, we think a lot about decentralization, especially here at Valley DAO, but I don't think it's two completely different models, right? You need some level of centralization because it's efficient. It's more, you can aggregate resources. You can do things at bigger scales than you can do if you are totally distributed. So yeah, super interesting. Also wanted to ask for the audience today, why is this problem so important? Why are you tackling these issues in particular, and what do they unlock and open up for these communities around the world?
I think they're important because wherever in the world someone is doing biology, whether it's a kind of curiosity-driven research project or whether it's an innovation project, if they're doing synthetic biology, bioengineering of the type that the IGEM community are very familiar with, they need reagents. It's an absolute essential. It's an enabling and foundational technology. And I think I interviewed 50 to 60 molecular biologists before kind of really embarking on this project to validate, is this a problem that people are experiencing? Is this the problem that my background could contribute to? And basically, yes. And I think there's one very obvious issue, which is affordability. So in many parts of the world, research grants are very limited. It may be more expensive. We're already in very well-resourced countries. Group leaders and researchers will complain about the cost of reagents. But it's not just the money, it's also the time. So if you've got to ship these reagents around, often on a cold chain, you may not receive your reagent order for 4, possibly 6, possibly 8 weeks. And when you think about that, even from an academic research perspective, that is very constraining on your ability to do the science. It didn't work, I need a new enzyme, I need some new primers. Okay, wait 2 months, start again. If you think about that in a bioinnovation context in terms of startups, that timing just is not going to work, right? We can't build a bioeconomy with 2 to 2 month wait times if an experiment fails. And it also fundamentally alters the type of research that people do. So if you know that is an issue, you're going to be more inclined, and directors of kind of research institutes in Africa have told me this, that they wish they could just kind of send their students off into the lab to play, to take risks, to tinker, to do all of the things that IGEM teams love to do. You don't know if it's going to work, you're just going to try it anyway. That's impossible if you're resource constrained and you know that every time it doesn't work you have to wait 2-3 months for something to arrive. So it means that you're more prone to take lower risks, and I feel like it fundamentally changes the type of research that happens, and it's fundamentally constraining to a functioning innovation ecosystem. And so that is why we're focusing on that problem. There are many other problems. I'm not saying that you could fix the reagent distribution network to be perfect and everybody gets all their reagents in 2 days. You'd still have problems with investment, with equipment maintenance, with a whole ton of other stuff. But this is one area where there is a clear need, and we have to start moving forward on some problems. So that's why we think it's important, because I don't think without it we'll really get an equitable distribution of activity in synthetic biology, R&D and innovation around the world. And so it's one piece of the puzzle that has to be in place.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that explanation. And just wanted to highlight again what you mentioned there about how access to technologies and resources affects risk appetite in science. And science, I think many people, especially on the outside of science, think of it as this fundamentally risky thing. But and we've observed this as well, and part of the problems that we've tried to address at ValiDAO is that, academics are under a lot of pressure, in particular, to publish, to get results. And so that also changes the types of research that they do, and perhaps are engaging in things that are a little bit less risky or safer because their careers depend on it. So I think one of the things that in an ideal world, at least I would definitely have, is a universal basic income for researchers where they can afford to take those risks and it's not going to affect their career or their prospects, and potentially positively affect their career prospects as well if they find something amazing. Super interesting points. I wanted to, you did kind of allude to this already, but I wanted to ask you also about what are some of the other problems that you've brushed up against in engaging with these types of communities. As you said, you've spoken with 60 researchers, so I'm sure that reagents wasn't the only one. So could you highlight some of the others?
Yeah, sure. At a research level, definitely just scale of resourcing. The grants that are accessible to people are often limited in lower resource, low middle income countries. Also, equipment is a challenge. And then once you've got the equipment, maintaining that equipment, servicing that equipment, having it functional is a real challenge. There's also access to training. There's a lot of training opportunities, but travel is a real issue with visas and that kind of thing. We heard an announcement this week that Kenya has removed all visa restrictions for Africans, so I'm hoping this makes Kenya the next go-to for scientific conferences, because the amount of times we've had collaborators refuse these, you need to have global mobility, but you also don't need. So we're trying to kind of balance, like you were talking about, you're trying to balance centralization and decentralization. We're also trying to balance like removing the need to depend on researchers in the global north to just do your fundamental research, while also allowing collaborations that are useful and are impactful and people want to happen to go ahead. So there has to be a level of like international funding availability and global mobility that gives people the ability, the chance to work with others in other regions, but not that they fundamentally depend on that to be able to pursue their own ideas. And I think that's the kind of power imbalance that currently exists. Like many researchers that we talk to, partly because of the reagent issue, partly due to access to facilities, they kind of have to have international collaborators, and that feels like an equity problem that needs addressing. And so we're trying to balance that. And I think also like in growing the communities, so trying to get that sort of perhaps more centralized pots of funding to support that, but also more regionalized support. So again, you're kind of de-risking a little bit the kind of financial sustainability of the effort. And we've sort of taken a different approach with kind of supporting companies, and that's more partnering with like people that have community expertise in incubation and acceleration of entrepreneurship communities, which is not my background. So the Reclone community that I mentioned, that's more the kind of technical community, the R&D people, and then really I think we're just at the beginning stages of figuring out what support companies need, because that's very different. When we have supported as a pilot a company in Cameroon, and there the issues we definitely saw were all of the above. But then if you're trying to build a biomanufacturing company, there's all sorts of problems which are just the problems of doing business in an emerging economy, whether it's access to working capital, access to kind of reasonable loans, access to easy registration of documentation, like customs and shipping and supply chains. All of those, they are also like, I don't know, they're magnified if you're trying to do something commercially. So I think that all of those problems we're aware of, and kind of where possible we're partnering with other people that we feel are in a better position to address them. And then other ones, we only have limited influence on kind of geopolitical issues and other stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love the thing that you mentioned about the entrepreneurship as well. I think we get asked at ValleyDAO a lot about why we do what we do and why we're trying to create a digitally decentralized ecosystem for innovation. And the answer lies in the fact that you have these hubs that exist, like San Francisco, like Boston, that are booming places for conducting biotech business. And even the next best competitor, like, for example, London, doesn't even come close to San Francisco, for example. So when you compare it to a developing economy, you have obviously nowhere near equal access to those resources, but also just knowledge and network, right? And I think those are two major problems that we can solve as a digital community, is providing that access to both knowledge and network to be able to make these things happen. So yeah, I think when answering that question, it's always like we're trying to create that ecosystem that exists in San Francisco, but translate that to the rest of the world so that we can have more equitable development in these super awesome and powerful technologies. So one final question that I wanted to leave the audience with is, what do you think are some of the unique strengths of like Africa, for example, in the bioeconomy, and what role do you think that it could play in the future if all things work out more equitably?
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, Africa and Latin America are absolute biodiversity hotspots. So, I mean, if we're thinking about the future of the bioeconomy being finding useful, taking the space that evolution has provided us with amazing inventions and innovations around bioprocessing or drugs and other molecules, like the source of a lot of that diversity is in countries that currently cannot take it through to a product. And so that is, for me, a rather that's an exemplification of the level of inequity, is that if you look at papers that have taken something maybe from a plant or from an extremophile, often it has been sourced in a country where the molecular work has not been undertaken. It's been kind of outsourced to somewhere else, and that also eventually lends in kind of intellectual property being assigned in other places, and perhaps not that benefit sharing flowing back. There are, of course, lots of models now around that, Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing models, but But I think like that's a key strength and resource that is in place, and we would really kind of we're focused more on the manufacturing part, but really trying to string together the partners that can take something through accessing the local biodiversity to characterizing, finding a super useful enzyme for a local industry, manufacturing it and applying it. I think if we can kind of break that cycle of dependency on sorts of, and again, dependency is a bad thing, collaboration is not a bad thing, so it's kind of differentiating between that. It's not saying that everything has to happen in the same country. Science thrives on international collaboration and exchange of ideas, but it's just that kind of, if it can in principle happen, I think that's a really powerful thing, because what it's also very rich in is challenges. I mean, there's so much we could apply biotechnology to in addressing challenges that are quite specific to Latin America and Africa, for example. Very strong on talented scientists that have amazing ideas, they just can't implement them. So I think that's really a strength. And also, masses of, if we're talking about the bioeconomy in terms of land mass and kind of production of biomaterials and biomass, Africa as a continent produces huge amounts. So I think there's resourcing there. There's amazing biodiversity to explore. There's amazing people, and then it's like we're focused on kind of some of those pragmatic challenges. I think there's still a lot of work to do, obviously, at the more like policy, regulatory level as well, to ease some of that, because it kind of moves in step with the technology. So if you're in a country where that technology is not so developed or hasn't been applied, or there's no push from the private sector or even necessary from researchers, then the regulatory kind of capacity is not going to move as quickly as elsewhere. So I think everything kind of links, and that's what makes it so complex. And you mentioned ecosystem, like it totally is an ecosystem. And I think so I'd say Africa is incredibly strong on particular components of that ecosystem, and there's just a sort of combined effort required by, of course, amazing people on the continent, and also I hope like sorts of people who work, collaborators from outside, to really bring that together.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jenny, and thank you everybody for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we hope to continue to engage with you and keep doing the awesome work that you're doing.